The call came at 2:47 in the morning. Not a knock, not a doorbell. A call. The kind where someone lets it ring once, hangs up, then calls again immediately. Because they know you're awake, and they know you already know something is wrong. Marcus Vale sat up in the dark of his Portland apartment and stared at the number on his screen for 3 full seconds before he answered. It was Sasha. Her voice was strange, not panicked, worse than that. Hollow. Like she'd already processed the emotion and was now just delivering information. "They're never going to let her out," Sasha said. "Daniel filed for permanent guardianship last week. I just found out. Marcus, they're going to keep her in there forever." He didn't say anything for a long time. Outside, rain moved across the city in slow gray sheets. "Tell me everything," he said. If a story like this one has ever made you stop and wonder how well you really know the person sleeping beside you, subscribe before we go any further. Hit like, drop a comment. Because what happened to Elena Marsh is the kind of story that will sit in your chest long after this video ends. And you need to hear all of it. Her name was Elena Marsh, and 5 years ago she was the kind of woman people described using the word light without realizing they were doing it. She taught 3rd grade at Pemberton Elementary. She planted sunflowers in her classroom every April and made her students memorize 1 poem a week. Not to test them, just because she believed that beautiful language should live somewhere inside a person from an early age. She had a laugh that arrived a half second before anyone expected it, loud and unself-conscious, the kind of laugh that made strangers in restaurants turn and smile without knowing why. She volunteered at the food pantry on Saturdays. She baked sourdough for neighbors she'd never formally met and left it on their porches with small, handwritten notes. She called her sister Claire every Sunday at 6 p.m. without fail, not because it was scheduled, just because that's who she was. She was, by every measurable standard, completely, undeniably fine. And then, according to her husband Daniel, she wasn't. That's the version that got her committed. His version. Calm, detailed, heartbroken. The version that made every doctor in that room look at the weeping man in the good suit and think, "This poor man has tried so hard." He said it started gradually. Small things at first. Elena convinced she'd left a burner on when she hadn't. Elena waking him at 3 a.m., certain someone had been in the house. He said she started checking the locks obsessively, 10, 15 times before bed. He said she accused the woman next door of watching her through the fence. And then, he said, and this is the part he delivered with his voice cracking and his eyes wet, she accused him. Said he was putting something in her food, said she could taste it. He brought documentation, written notes she'd allegedly left around the house, words crawling across the paper at strange angles, letters half-formed. He brought a recording, just audio, of her screaming at him that he was trying to kill her. He brought a letter from their family doctor saying that Elena had presented twice in 6 months with complaints of dizziness, paranoia, and unreality episodes. He held her hand in the intake office. He kissed her forehead before they closed the door. Elena said she wasn't sick. The doctors wrote that down as clinical evidence that she was. Cedarwood Psychiatric Facility sat on 12 acres of carefully maintained grounds in a town that had no particular reason to exist except for the facility itself. The buildings were newer than you'd expect. The lighting was warm. They had a garden, a craft room, a library with real books, counselors who remembered your name and asked how you slept. It was designed to feel like care. It felt, to Elena, like a very comfortable coffin. Year 1 she spent fighting. She refused medication twice before the court order made refusal irrelevant. She demanded phone calls that were carefully supervised. She wrote letters to her sister Claire that, she would learn years later, were intercepted and never sent. She told every doctor, every nurse, every counselor with a clipboard, "I am not sick. Something is wrong, but it is not my mind." Every time she said it, they noted it, labeled it, used it. Year 2, the fighting wore her body down. The medication made her feel like she was thinking through wet concrete. She became slower, softer, easier to redirect. The staff noted with satisfaction that she was responding to treatment. She wasn't responding. She was drowning and learning to float. Year 3, something collapsed inside her. Not her mind, but the structure she'd built around her certainty. She started to wonder. Late at night, in that particular darkness of an institutional room, she would lie there and think, what if they're right? What if the Elena I remember was the sick one? What if I invented a version of myself that never existed? That is what they never show you in movies about wrongful commitment. Not the locked doors, not the injections, the quiet, grinding, invisible work of an institution convincing you, over years, that your own memory is a symptom. Year 4, she planted tomatoes in the courtyard. She started sitting with newer patients who were too frightened to eat. She learned the soft language of cedarwood, how to say things without triggering concern, how to be present without being noticed, how to exist in a way that gave them nothing to document. The staff called her a model patient. She called it survival. Year 5, February. A Tuesday morning with thin gray light across the garden beds. Marcus Vale walked through the front doors and asked to speak with the director. He looked like someone who had not slept correctly in a long time. That was the first thing the director, Dr. Harmon, noticed. Not his briefcase, not his pressed shirt, but the specific exhaustion around his eyes that comes not from lack of sleep, but from carrying something heavy for too long. He sat down across from her and placed the briefcase on the table between them. "I need you to hear everything before you say anything," he said. "I need you to not stop me in the middle, because if you stop me, I'll lose my nerve, and this woman has already lost 5 years." Dr. Harmon looked at the briefcase, then at him. Then she folded her hands on the desk and said, "Go ahead." What Marcus said in that room took 47 minutes. What he placed on the desk, documents, financial records, a toxicology report commissioned by a private laboratory, a sworn statement from a chemist, property transfer filings, a copy of Elena's grandmother's estate trust with 3 specific lines highlighted in yellow, took another 25 minutes for Dr. Harmon to read. When she finished, she set the papers down very carefully. Her hands were not steady. "Wait here," she said. She found Elena in the garden, on her knees in the dirt, pressing seedlings into the February soil with the focused patience of someone who has learned to make meaning out of small acts. "Elena." Her voice was different. Elena heard it immediately. The thinness in it, the way it arrived without the professional warmth she'd spent 5 years learning to read. "There's someone here to see you. I don't want visitors." "I think," Dr. Harmon stopped, tried again. "I think you'll want this one." Elena sat back on her heels and looked at her. In 5 years, she had never seen this woman uncertain. She pulled off her garden gloves and stood. The visitation room had a window that faced the courtyard garden. Elena had sat in this room dozens of times for therapy sessions, for assessments, for the occasional approved visitor. She knew every detail of it. The faint scratch on the second chair from the left. The way the afternoon light hit the corner of the table at an angle that briefly, painfully reminded her of the kitchen in her old house. Marcus was standing by the window with his back to her. When the door opened, he turned, and Elena Marsh, who had not seen Marcus Vale in 11 years, who had not thought about him in almost as many, who had spent 5 years inside a psychiatric facility, slowly losing and reclaiming and losing again her faith in her own mind, stopped walking entirely. Something moved across his face that she couldn't name. Not one emotion. All of them at once, crashing together. Relief, grief, fury, guilt. The expression of a man who has been running toward something for a long time and has finally, terrifyingly, arrived. He crossed the room in 4 steps and put both hands on her arms. Not like a lover, like someone terrified she might fall. "Elena," he said. Just her name. Like he'd been holding it in his chest for years, and this was the first time it was safe to let it out. She stared at him. "I know," he said. "I know everything. I know what he did. I'm sorry it took me this long. I'm so sorry, I should have." His voice broke on the last word. He steadied himself. "But I have you now. I promise you, I have you." The woman who had not cried in 14 months, who had learned to keep her tears internal, private, hidden from clipboards and documentation, felt something rupture somewhere deep in her chest. Her knees buckled. He caught her. Here is what Marcus knew. Here is what he'd been carrying. 3 years after Elena disappeared into Cedarwood, he was at a research conference in Portland. He worked in financial forensics, which would later turn out to be the most important accident of fate in this entire story, and ran into Sasha Chen, a mutual friend from their early 20s. They had coffee. They talked about old friends the way people do when they're circling back through their past without really meaning to. And Sasha, stirring her cup, said, "Did you ever hear about Elena? She's still at Cedarwood. Daniel remarried last spring. Seems happy." Remarried. Marcus looked at Sasha and said nothing. He smiled at something she said next. He finished his coffee. He said it was good to see her. And then he sat in his car in the parking garage for 20 minutes, trying to understand why the word remarried had hit him like a punch. He told himself it was nothing. Old guilt. The specific ache of someone you cared about having a hard life after you left. He went back to Portland. He tried to move on. He lasted 6 weeks. Then he started asking questions. Carefully, laterally, the way someone asks questions when they don't know what they're afraid of finding. He found Sasha again. He found Elena's sister Claire, living in Sacramento, having been gently, consistently discouraged by Daniel from any contact with Elena on the grounds that outside relationships destabilize her recovery. Claire had not seen her sister in 4 years. She had been told this was what was best for Elena. She had been told this by the man who put Elena in that building. Something cold and methodical moved through Marcus. He recognized the feeling from work. He'd felt it before, when financial documents didn't quite add up, and the explanation someone offered was technically plausible, but just slightly too smooth. He started pulling threads. Elena Marsh had inherited money. Not generational wealth, nothing that would make headlines, but significant. A property trust established by her grandmother, conservatively managed, worth approximately $2.3 million at the time of Elena's commitment. The trust had conditions, as old trusts often do. Drafted by a lawyer in a different era, never updated. Full of the kind of language that seems reasonable in the abstract and becomes a loaded weapon in the wrong hands. The trust transferred fully to Elena at age 35. or upon her death. Or, and here was the clause, buried in subsection 4, paragraph 2, in language that a layperson would read 3 times and still not quite catch. In the event of the beneficiary being legally declared mentally incompetent and placed under long-term custodial care, at which point control transferred to the primary spouse or next of kin. Elena had been committed at 32. She turned 35 inside Cedarwood. By the time she did, Daniel had already transferred the trust into an account structure that left him as sole controller. He had documentation for every step. 2 doctors' signatures. A judge who'd spent 15 minutes on the case before approving it. A system that had every reason to believe a weeping husband over a woman screaming that she wasn't sick. But here is what Daniel had not accounted for: the compound he'd used. It wasn't poison. Nothing so dramatic. It was a dissociative agent, technically legal in small quantities, used in some clinical contexts, difficult to detect and metabolized relatively quickly. He had administered it to Elena over the course of approximately 3 weeks, mixed into her coffee every morning, in doses carefully calibrated to produce exactly the symptoms he needed: paranoia, disorientation, perceptual disturbances, emotional volatility. The symptoms were real. They showed up in her blood work as generalized neurological stress, consistent with, the doctors noted, early-onset psychotic disorder. The cause had been right there in the coffee mug. By the time Elena was tested inside Cedarwood, the compound was gone. Her symptoms had partially resolved. The doctors attributed the improvement to medication and structured care. They documented her remaining emotional distress as evidence of underlying pathology. What Marcus had, obtained through a private forensic laboratory using samples from Elena's medical intake records that had been improperly stored rather than destroyed, was a trace analysis. Not definitive on its own, but combined with the financial documents, the trust records, the suspiciously convenient timeline, the testimony of a chemist who could speak to the compound's properties and detection window, the pattern of Claire's blocked contact, and Daniel's remarkably swift remarriage exactly 8 months after Elena's commitment, it was enough. It was more than enough. Dr. Harmon had already called the police and a forensic attorney by the time she came back to sit with Marcus and Elena. Elena had stopped crying. She was sitting very still in the way she'd learned, controlled, internal, present. But her eyes were moving across Marcus's face like she was relearning something she'd forgotten the language of. 3 weeks, she said. Her voice was quiet, level. The voice of someone who has been careful for so long that even devastation arrives measured. He did it for 3 weeks. Yes. I told him I felt wrong. I kept telling him something was wrong with me. She paused. He told me he'd get me help. Marcus didn't look away. He drove me here. She pressed her fingers against her own sternum, like she was checking whether her heart was still doing what it was supposed to. He walked me through those doors, and he kissed my forehead, and he said... She stopped, swallowed. He said, I love you. I'll visit every week. The room held the silence. He visited 4 times in 5 years, she said. Daniel Marsh was arrested on a Wednesday morning, standing in the driveway of the house he'd bought with Elena's trust money, holding a coffee in the same hand he was using to check his phone. He looked confused at first. The specific confusion of a man who has been so certain of his own impunity for so long that the arrival of consequences registers as a kind of administrative error. Then he saw the forensic accountant standing beside the detective, saw the documentation folder under her arm. His face changed. Elena didn't watch the arrest in real time. She watched the news footage the following evening on a tablet the facility's legal team provided,
sitting in the garden, her garden, with Claire beside her for the first time in 4 years, their shoulders touching in the cool evening air. When the footage showed the handcuffs, Elena made no sound. She watched his face as they walked him to the car.
Watched him search the crowd, probably for a lawyer, probably for an exit, probably for any version of this moment that could still go his way. She felt something arrive in her chest that she hadn't felt since before Cedarwood. Not happiness, not triumph. Something quieter and more profound than either. She felt real. The trial took 11 months. Elena testified for 2 full days, and she was... Every journalist in that courtroom would write some version of this sentence in their coverage. The most composed, precise, and devastating witness they had ever seen. Which made sense if you understood what she'd survived. She had spent 5 years in an environment designed to find instability in her. She had learned to choose every word like it might be used against her. She had learned that composure was protection, that clarity was armor, that the most powerful thing she could do in any room full of people with clipboards was to be unambiguously, unfailingly herself. Daniel had spent 5 years accidentally training her to destroy him in court. She never raised her voice. She answered every question directly and completely. When Daniel's defense attorney tried to suggest that her account of events might be colored by her psychiatric history, Elena looked at him with an expression that several jurors would later describe as, like being looked at by someone who has already thought of everything you're about to say, and is mildly disappointed that's all you have. And said, "The psychiatric history you're referring to was manufactured by the man sitting at that table. Every document I have produced in this case proves that. Would you like to go through them again?" The attorney moved on. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and 55 minutes. Guilty. On every count. She was standing in the courthouse hallway when they read it. She'd stepped out for water, couldn't be in the room for the actual moment, didn't want to perform a reaction for the gallery. She stood in that hallway with a paper cup of lukewarm water and listened to the muffled sound of the verdict being read through the closed door. Then she heard it. She pressed her palm flat against the wall. Cool plaster. Real. Solid. Claire appeared from around the corner. She'd been watching through the door's small window, and walked straight to her and put her arms around her without saying anything. Just held on. They stood like that for a long time. 2 sisters who had been kept apart for years by a man who had understood correctly that a woman with people who believe in her is much harder to erase. She went back to teaching. It took time. Everything took time, and she stopped apologizing for that. Therapy, chosen by her, with a therapist who had read her full case file and treated her like a person rather than a phenomenon. Learning how to be alone in a room with a door she could open. Learning how to sleep without listening for footsteps in the corridor. Learning to trust her own mind again. That was the part she hadn't anticipated. The vindication came. The sentence came. 14 years, with an additional civil judgment that returned what remained of the trust. The newspaper stories came, and the documentary inquiry, and the letters from strangers who said, "This happened to someone I love. I never understood it until now." All of it came. And still, some mornings, she would catch herself second-guessing a simple memory, wondering for just a half-second whether she'd imagined it, before she remembered, before she pulled herself back, before she said quietly, out loud if necessary, "Your mind is fine. Your mind was always fine." You survived exactly what happened to you, and not one thing more. That mantra, that small daily reclamation, that took the longest. The first morning back in a classroom, she arrived an hour early and sat at her desk in the empty room and just existed in it. Small chairs, morning light through windows she could open. The particular smell of new crayons and old books that she had loved since she was 7 years old and first understood what a classroom could mean. A girl named Rosie arrived 12 minutes before the bell. One of those children who is simply constitutionally early, dropped her backpack and looked at her new teacher with the uncomplicated directness of an 8-year-old. "You look like you might have a sad memory," Rosie said. Elena looked at her. "I do," she said, "but I'm working on making some new ones." Rosie considered this with great seriousness. "My grandma says the new ones go on top," she said, "like a stack." "Your grandma is right." Rosie sat down and unpacked her pencil case with the satisfaction of someone who has just resolved something. Elena looked at the empty chairs around her, the morning light, the sunflowers she'd planted in pots along the windowsill the day before, small and green and reaching. She breathed in. She breathed out. Marcus drove her home the evening of the verdict. He'd been careful with her all year. Careful in the way you're careful with something that matters, something you already failed once to recognize the full value of before it was gone. He parked on her street and let the silence sit for a moment. "Why did you keep going?" she said. Not for the first time. She'd asked variations of this throughout the year. But tonight it felt different. Tonight it was the real question. "When it was taking too long, when the documents weren't enough yet, when the attorney said the case was thin. Why didn't you stop?" He looked out at the quiet street. "Because I walked away from you when we were 24, he said. "And I told myself it was the right thing. She deserves more. That's what I said. What scared young men say when they're actually just too afraid to stay." He glanced at her. "I've carried that for a long time. And when Sasha said your name in that parking lot, and something felt wrong, I think part of me knew that if I looked away again, I wouldn't be able to live with who that made me." Elena was quiet. "It wasn't about us," he said. "I need you to know that. It wasn't me trying to fix something old. It was you. The person I remembered. I couldn't leave you in there." She looked at her hands, turned them over. The hands that had planted tomatoes in an institutional garden for 2 years. The hands that had gripped a courtroom railing while she dismantled 5 years of someone else's lies. "You didn't save me," she said. "I know. I need you to know I know that." She looked at him steadily. "I saved myself. I stayed myself. I held on." A pause. "You just handed me the door." He nodded. "I know. And I'm grateful you were still strong enough to walk through it." She sat with that for a moment. Then she got out of the car, walked to her door, and turned around. He was watching her, the way he'd been watching her since that first day in the visitation room, with an attention that wasn't romantic so much as reverential, the look of someone who has witnessed something they can't categorize. She thought about 5 years, about dirt under her fingernails in February, about mornings she'd lain in a facility room and not been sure if the woman she remembered had ever been real, about a verdict being read through a closed door, about Rosie and the stack of memories and the sunflowers on the windowsill, about all the ways a person can be buried
and still managed to keep breathing. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make coffee." A beat. A small, involuntary sound of laughter escaped her. Because of everything, of all the things she could have offered, she'd said coffee, and they both felt the weight and absurdity of that word between them. He got out of the car. There is a term, gaslighting, that we use so often now that it has started to feel like a small word for a small thing. A disagreement, a minor manipulation.
But what Daniel Marsh did to Elena was not small. He systematically dismantled a person. He used medicine, law, money, time, and the fundamental human tendency to trust a man who cries convincingly to erase someone, to replace who she was with what served him, to lock her so completely inside someone else's narrative that even she began to lose the thread of her own. He almost won. He didn't. Not because the system caught him. It didn't, not for years. Not because anyone with authority protected her. They didn't. He didn't win because Elena Marsh, in the deepest and most unobserved corner of herself, refused to stop existing. She planted tomatoes. She memorized new patients' names. She learned to be still without disappearing. She held the smallest possible version of herself carefully in the center of her chest and did not let it go, even when every document and diagnosis and locked door told her it was a delusion. She survived because she never entirely stopped being herself. Marcus just helped her prove it. The final line Daniel Marsh heard before his sentencing wasn't from a judge or an attorney. It was from Elena. She stood at the podium and looked at him for a long time without speaking, and when she finally did, her voice was the voice of someone who has nothing left to lose and everything to reclaim. "I forgive you," she said. "Not for your sake. Not because what you did deserves forgiveness, but because I have already given you 5 years of my life, and I will not give you one single day more." The room was completely silent. She gathered her papers, stepped back from the podium, and walked out of that courtroom without looking at him again. That was the last time she walked away from something she didn't choose. Everything after that, every morning, every classroom, every Sunday call to Claire, every cup of coffee she drank without fear, was her own. Entirely, irrevocably, beautifully her own. If this story stayed with you, if something in it made you catch your breath or think of someone you know, please subscribe and leave a comment below telling me what part hit hardest. These stories exist because of you, and the next one might be even harder to believe.